All right. Looks like we are at quarter till, ready to get started on the next session here at IIoT World's Manufacturing Day. So this session is all about who is attacking smart factories. And my name is Chris Lukey. I'm the host of the manufacturing podcast, Manufacturing Happy Hour, and I'm excited to be joined by Udo Schneider today, who knows the dangers lurking across the internet, but also how to protect against them. In his current position as IoT Security Evangelist Europe at Trend Micro, he focuses primarily on industrial automation and IoT security. Before this, as a solutions architect, he worked on topics like cloud computing, virtualization encryption, as well as network security. He also served as product marketing manager and as channel development manager. He has a long history in this market, having led other vendors within the IT security space, including Checkpoint Technologies and Parametrics Systems. Udo, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, good evening to everyone here. As a little bit of maintenance before we get started, this session will last for half an hour. The next session starts immediately after this, so we'll be here for 30 minutes today. And as I kicked off the topic, who is attacking smart factories? Udo, that's where we'd love to start to get your perspectives on that as we get into the conversation.
Sure, let's just start right away. Let me start with one thing on this topic. If you are, let's say in manufacturing, if you are responsible for operations technology, don't panic. I know that coming from an IT security background, many IT security experts tend to be in panic regarding OT security, but my hint at that moment is don't panic. Let me start explain why I start with that premise of don't panic. I think most of you, some of you may know something like the fire triangle. You need something like oxygen, you need heat, and you need actual fuel for a fire to exist. If you don't have one of those three components, let's say, or if one of those components is missing, you won't have a fire. And I came up with something similar for, let's say, evaluating the risk of IoT attacks or smart factory attacks. Let's start with the first side, and that's basically vulnerabilities. This may be one slide where IT security experts will tell you, well, I always told you that those ICS systems are vulnerable, that you didn't patch their systems, things like that. And to be honest, they're right. I mean, if you just take a look at the number of vulnerabilities, the number of exploits, let's say, being published by ICS Cert over the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, you will see that the number of threats is continuously rising. So you might guess, well, maybe the risk is as big as those IT security experts are telling you. Let's just switch over to the second side. The second side is, even if those systems do have vulnerabilities, is it actually possible to find victims? And the short answer, once again, kind of, let's say, making the IT experts nervous is sure. I mean, if you're taking a look at IoT search engines like Shodan or ZoomEye or Census, I mean, given that your IP connection or given that your internet connection is fast enough, you can even scan the whole IPv4 address space in under a day. So is it possible to find possible victims? Yeah, sure. And that's not the point where IT security experts tell you that the sky will fall down, that everybody will be hacked, that it is as bad as it can be. And the truth is, well, it's not quite as bad. Let me kind of rewind the time a few years back. If you take a look at which kind of attacks have already been discovered in the past over the last 10 years, I mean, for sure there were attacks. I mean, I think that the most prominent, of course, is Stuxnet. Everybody is and was talking about Stuxnet. I mean, we were talking about DoQ, about Shamoon, about Black Energy, things like that. So definitely there are attacks on ICS systems. So once again, this may be a point for the IT security guys. But the interesting fact to notice here is that most of those attacks have been at least attributed to state-sponsored attackers or state-sponsored attacker groups. So we're not talking about the common cyber criminal. We're talking about politically motivated actors. And although that's bad, don't get me wrong on that, the point is that as long as the common cyber criminal doesn't step into the game, it's not as bad as it could be. But that's exactly the point where we are now. So if you take a look at something like 2007, 2008-ish roundabout, you would see that that's 17 or 18, sorry for that one. You would see that cyber criminals started to, I'd say, gain interest in exposing, in hacking, in leveraging hacked ICS systems. So I think everybody has heard about WannaCry or PTR or not PTR, what things like that. The interesting thing is, if you took a look at the media back then, you saw big media articles like WannaCry brings down automotive productions. WannaCry brings down factories. And NotPetya basically ruins a whole value chain. The interesting thing about WannaCry and NotPetya, maybe even more about WannaCry, is the fact that WannaCry did have a huge impact on some production facilities. True. However, WannaCry was never designed to wreak havoc in production environments. It basically was just, in quotes, just collateral damage. I mean, it's bad enough, but the intention of WannaCry was not to stop a production facility or not to stop PLCs or stop HMI systems out there. It was basically just collateral damage. However, and that's kind of a, let's say, self-fulfilling prophecy, cybercriminals noted that, well, wait a minute, we have our traditional ransomware, our traditional arsenal of attack tools, and we have victims that are basically unable to produce anymore. Maybe we should find a way to leverage this new kind of, let's say, of target customer. Let's phrase it in a different way. So there is a victim that is affected by our current malware, by our current attacks. Maybe we should try to somehow gain money out of that. And that's the point where we are right now. So at the moment, we do see attacks, we do see malware that is specifically crafted for attacking ICS environments, for attacking OT environments. And I think that's from a, let's say, from a mindset perspective, I think that's the third side of that triangle. We have the vulnerabilities for sure. You can actually find victims. That's also quite easy. And the only thing, in quotes, only thing that was missing was a, let's say, sustainable business model. And I think that's the kind of shift that we have to take a look at. It's not so much about the technical ability to infect or to, let's say, attack ICS systems, because I mean, that's a given. The question is, if we want to talk about attacks on a large scale, then large scale kind of implies that it's the common cyber criminal that needs to be interested in that kind of business model, in that kind of, let's say, endeavor. And the cyber criminal is only motivated by money. So he's always thinking, or she's always thinking in business models. So what happened between, let's say, 2017 and 2018 until today is that they actually came up with a business model. So if we're talking about who is attacking ICS systems or who is attacking smart factories, I would say it's, let's say, state-sponsored attackers, or let's say professional cyber espionage actors, for sure. I mean, they have been doing this for the last, I don't know, 20, 15, 10 years, depending on how connected your facility has been. But the common cyber criminal only within the last, I would say, 5-ish years has actually realized, well, there is a potential in there. And right now they came up with a business model. I think that's the thing that we have to understand. It doesn't make sense from an IT perspective to only talk about vulnerabilities and, let's say, exposed victims, because as long as there is no business model underneath, there is no large scale value in attacking those systems. But we do have the business model now. I mean, not we, but the cyber criminals. So to understand why we had that shift in, let's say, in the attack landscape, it's important to take a look at the different business models as well. So the big question here is, if I do have access to a compromised ICS environment, how can I gain any kind of money out of that? And talking about political actors, the thing to realize here is that the, let's say, regular political actor has no financial motivation. I mean, the goal here is to either, let's say, denial of service, so make preventing anything from being produced, or actual destruction of equipment, talking about Stuxnet, for instance. So the return of investment in terms of money is simply not there. So that's not a viable business model for a, let's say, cyber criminal. The next thing would be industrial espionage. And yeah, true. I mean, this could be something. If I'm stealing valuable IP, I could try to resell that IP. However, the market for that resold IP is pretty small. It's pretty hard to get the right buyer for the stolen IP. So yeah, there is some kind of return of investment, but it's not as big, so that it actually makes sense to have this in a large scale attack. What happened, however, is, and that's, by the way, comparable to what happened in healthcare, is that, let's say, non-industrial focused cybercriminal groups realized that simple extortion, so through ransomware, simply works. That's a business model that works. So if they succeeded in infecting, let's say, a hospital, the chances that the hospital was paying the ransom were pretty high. And the same was true for, let's say, for a infection in an ICS environment. This didn't mean that the actual attack was specifically targeted at production environment, but once they got lucky, or once they kind of, let's say, did a lateral movement or a north-south movement between the office IT and the production IT, they realized, well, if I happen to infect, let's say, an HMI or let's say the MES system, the chances of the victim actually paying the ransom is quite high. And this is what actually I would call a collateral damage. So we had cybercriminal groups who actually didn't specialize in OT security, or didn't specialize in ICS attacks. They were just doing their usual spray and pray approach, infecting office IT environments, and just by accident got, in quotes, lucky, and infected an ICS environment, and found out, well, let's say the willingness of the victim to pay for decrypting the actual ICS environment is even higher than in the office IT space. So basically, let's say the victims kind of proved that business model was working. This was quite interesting. This was a stage where we, for instance, had attackers who compromised engineering workstations. And basically, we had a honeypot, and the engineering workstation was encrypted. And we communicated with the attacker and told him, well, how do we know that you actually can decrypt our files back? And he told us, well, just send me one unimportant file, and I will decrypt the file for you so that you can actually have the proof that it works. And we basically sent him the engineering workstation database. So this was the single most important file on that machine. And I mean, this was an office IT specialized attacker. He didn't even recognize what it was, decrypted it as a proof, and sent it back. So if this would have been a real attack, we would have got, let's say, the real important stuff back without even paying. So those attackers, those groups, didn't even realize what was important on an engineering workstation. However, that has changed. So what we're seeing right now are specialized cybercriminal groups focusing on attacking ICS systems. So they know what they have, they know what's important on an engineering workstation, they know what's important on an HMI, they know what's important, let's say, on the MES system, and they specifically aim for attacking, or to be more precise, for extorting those environments. They either attack those environments themselves, or they kind of buy infected victims from other groups. So if, let's say, one of those office IT groups succeeds in infecting let's say, a company, and recognizes, well, that there is a production facility attached somewhere, they kind of resell that lead to the guy specialized in, let's say, in extorting ICS environments. So that's the kind of mind shift that we have to take care of. It's not so much about attacking, let's say, those ICS environments with ICS specific threats. So nobody, or I don't want to say nobody, but it doesn't make sense to try to find a, sorry for the technical jargon, a buffer overflow in a Modbus communication. That's much too complicated. Basically, it's about extorting and encrypting right now. That's the working business model, the important files on, let's say, HMI systems, engineering workstations, and if you get lucky, maybe the MES database. So taking a look at the actual attack vectors, it's not so much attacking, it's not so much about, let's say, attacking in an ICS specific way, or just tailoring attacks to PLCs or to HMIs. So I just took out a few slides from, let's say, internal presentations highlighting attack vectors, and you would see that nearly none of those attacks are actually ICS specific. Most of the attacks that we have seen, most of the cases that got media attention, actually the initial infection vector was not ICS specific. We're still talking about social engineering. I mean, if you take a look at today's attack vectors, depending on who you're asking, you have something like 80 to 90% of all the, let's say, initial infection vectors are still coming over email. So phishing emails, for instance. If the attacker succeeds in initially, let's say, getting a foothold or a beachhead within the actual company, then they start, let's say, with well-known attacks, things like Eternal Blue, Eternal Keep. So sometimes vulnerabilities which are pretty old, to basically increase the size of his beachhead, including getting, let's say, access to MES systems, HMIs, PLCs, or things like that. So we're basically talking about a very traditional, let's say, Office IT-based attack chain. However, the goal is a different one. The goal is not to encrypt, I don't know, your holiday photos or to encrypt Word documents. The goal is encrypting important project files on the engineering workstation. The goal is in encrypting the database of the MES system, for instance. And it even gets worse. If you talk about, let's say, encrypting those files, it's just maybe just a single line or a single plant. However, because we're talking about IoT, I mean, IoT implies things being connected. So your actual value chain, your actually supply chain is more than just the actual production. It spans maybe from the production, from the manufacturing, up to the web shop where a customer can actually order something. And every kind of disruption within that value chain is a risk to your business. So it's not just about protecting the shop floor, it's basically about protecting every kind of actor or every kind of participant in that value chain or in that supply chain. So from a risk perspective, it doesn't matter whether the attacker succeeds in compromising, let's say, the MES database, or whether the attacker succeeds in compromising your web shop. In both cases, the end result after the queue has been, let's say, produced, is the fact that you can either not produce any goods anymore, or when the web shop was hacked, that you won't get any new orders. So from a security perspective, it's also important to just not take that let's say 10 feet view, but have that 30, 50, 40,000 level view, feet level view to see, well, what might be an impact to my value chain in general. This also brings us to what can be actually done. And I don't want to talk about technical measures and details. Basically, there are enough guidelines, regulations, and standards out there to cover things that you should do. I mean, if we're talking about traditional IT measures, I mean, we're talking about ISO 27K. We're talking about the NIST SP 853, I think, or the cybersecurity framework. So there are enough regulations out there or guidelines out there telling you how to run a secure IT environment. And the same is true for, let's say, the OT environment. I mean, we're talking about ISO 99 or IEC 62443. We're talking about the NIST document 800-82. I mean, dealing with OT-specific security threats. And overarching, once again, think of the value chain in general. It's a compliance approach as well. So how to make sure that my business actually runs. And this means securing the value chain that I depend upon. So from a security coverage point of view, this means you have to cover, let's say, all your bases, including IT and OT. This also means that those silos between IT and OT, they have to disappear, because that's exactly the gap that those cybercriminals are aiming for. If IT and OT does not, let's say, steer into the same direction, they will actually find the gap. This also means that from a Trend Micro perspective, I mean, that's now the, let's say, the advertisement, the commercial part. We basically not just focus on protecting the IT part or protecting the OT part. We basically provide solutions which cover the complete span. So from IT to OT in different kind of inclinations. So we have things like Cloud One, which is basically workload security, so service security. We're talking about protecting the network, or the, let's say, the choke point between office IT networks and production networks. We talk about traditional endpoint security. I mean, that's your usual office IT stuff. But we also talk about OT or ICS specific solutions, which might use the same technology, but do have a different goal, a different aim. And overarching of that one, of course, it's things like let's say central management, central insight into what happened within my value chain. So to make a very long story short, and I hope that I didn't get into too many details or too low level, the fact is that the cybercriminals found a business model that's actually working as of today. And the business model is basically extortion. It's ransomware. So it's not the technical fancy hacking stuff of PLCs or compromising, let's say, PLCs, changing production parameters, things like that. It's basically plain old ransomware, but it works. And the fact that if a victim got infected, the rate of payment, or let's say the rate of victims that are actually paying, is quite high, proves that business model. That's one important point. The other one is that although we're talking a lot about technical countermeasures here, technical countermeasures are just one very minor, and from my point of view, even the last thing that you should think about. It's about educating people. It's about basically making sure that everybody knows what's going on, what's the risk. I mean, that's the same compared to safety. Everybody has to know the risk, and that's also the case for security. And a technical countermeasure is a valid option, but it's just one of the options. And last but not least, don't restrict yourself to just thinking about HMIs or PLCs or shop floor security, because, as I said initially, once the value chain got compromised, it doesn't really matter whether you have absolutely state-of-the-art shop floor security. If there is no order coming through because the web shop got hacked, well, the value chain is broken anyway. So always take a more holistic approach to security. I hope that wasn't too much detail, let's say, too much technical stuff. And back to you.
I think that's great. You know, the things we're hearing are, at least I'm hearing on my podcast in this space, is that ransomware is where it's at right now. And I think you describing it as a business model really drives home the point that this is intentional. It's not kind of the havoc that other groups had been wreaking in the past. We've got about 7 minutes left, and we have about 7 questions that have come in. So
Perfect.
Udo, I'm gonna read those off, and if we can look towards like 1-minute answers on this. One of the first ones that's risen to the top here is a lot of the big automotive manufacturers still prefer storing data on private servers. How do you give more people confidence in the cloud from a security point of view?
This won't be a minute. I'm sorry. Basically, it's a risk assessment, risk evaluation strategy. So, I mean, having data on site versus having data in the cloud has different advantages and disadvantages. And I think the decision that has to be made, whether I want to have it on premise or in the cloud, has to be based on that risk assessment. The point isn't that that's something that we see a lot. Let's say when talk to people, is that those decisions are in many cases, let's say, made by a gut feeling. And I think that's the mistake that we're making, that we have those important decisions and that we don't do a thorough risk analysis, risk assessment, because based on that, for one automotive vendor or for one automotive OEM, the decision might be have everything on site and have redundant data centers and things geographically, let's say dislocated data centers and things like that. Or another might say, well, the effort to do it on site is much too high compared to the security, let's say maybe benefits that I'm seeing. So I'm going to the cloud. So I can't really say that's the better solution. It's really based on the risk assessment. And from a gut feeling, I would say a lot of companies don't do that risk assessment or just do it by gut feeling. And I think that's a bad thing to do. Sorry for that one.
No, great answer on that. A similar question around edge as well.
Mhm.
What types of challenges does edge add to ICS security as compute gets distributed?
If we're talking about edge, there are two things, let's say, to consider from a security perspective. The first one is having the actual workloads on edge servers. And I mean, whether I'm running a workload, let's say in my data center, on an edge server or in the cloud, it doesn't really matter. I mean, that workload should always assume that it's in hostile territory. I think that's the number one rule. Always never assume that you are in a safe or secure area. Always bring all the security with you. And then it shouldn't matter from a workload perspective, whether you're running at the edge, whether you're running on an Intel system or ARM or in the cloud. That's the workload perspective. The other one is more, if we're talking, for instance, about 5G or communications infrastructure, don't assume that just because you know a device, just because the device has a known SIM card or a known EMI in the SIM card, don't assume that it's the same device. So always verify, never trust. There's also one keyword going around, zero trust, and I think that's basically the mindset that you have to be in. Don't assume that your environment that you are running in is safe. And in that regard, bring along your own workload security and don't trust edge devices, especially mobile devices. Always verify.
Excellent. Another question that we've had pop up, and just so everyone knows, next session starts here in 3 minutes. It's in a separate room, so we may be able to stay a little longer after to answer some of these other ones. This next one addresses internal attacking sources. Is the percentage of cyber attacks still 63% internal sources? Someone else was saying, is it 68%? Is that, are we still seeing that as a majority?
Well, that's interesting because the initial number I heard something like, I don't know, 20 years ago was 83%. So the good news might be it has been decreasing. No, the fact is, and this is a very personal thing, I actually don't like that number. Not because it's wrong, but because it it doesn't convey whether the actual internal attack was, let's say, by intention or by accident. And I would say this rate of 63, let's say, percent or 50 or 6, whatever, I think that's a valid number. I think that kind of matches with my experience, let's say, out in the field. However, I would say the number or the percentage of let's say, those incidents by accident versus by intention is much higher. So I would say it's 90. I would say even 90% plus is by accident, and the rest is by intention. And I would say from a shop floor perspective, it's even lower. I mean, we had one case, just to tell you a story, where we had an HMI system that was always getting affected all day long, every time, again and again. It was cleaned, brought back up, and took something like a week, and the HMI was infected again. And we weren't able to figure out where the actual infection came from because, I mean, the system was basically air-gapped. And it turned out that we basically put stickers on the machine, don't attach any kind of USB thumb drives or mass storage to the HMI system, because that might be the source of the infection. And it turned out that, let's say, somebody on the shop floor actually read the sign, said, well, I don't have a USB thumb drive, I don't have a hard disk, but I want to charge my mobile phone. So they basically plugged in their mobile phone to the HMI system. I mean, the mobile phone back then was an Android device, which was recognized as a mass storage device on the HMI. Order run was executed, thanks to Windows XP, unpatched, of course, and we had that infection. So was this by accident or by intention? I would say it was by accident. So I would say this number of 63% sounds familiar, but I would start to differentiate between what's by accident and what's by intention.
I think that's a great way to kind of draw that distinction because that is a very important factor to consider in that. It looks like we've got time for one more question. I'm going to pick the one that's been upvoted the most here, and it's many industrial systems rely on obsolete platforms, for example, like Microsoft Windows NT. How does this affect vulnerability to well-known attacks already mitigated or patched on more recent platforms?
Um, let's say from an attack chain perspective, I would say that's the number one weakness that we see, that we have those old platforms that are either not being supported anymore, that are either not getting patched anymore, or that where somebody took the conscious decision to not patch it, to not risk, let's say, things like safety or availability. Um, if this is part, or let's say, if you have such an old environment, or if you have such an old machine within your environment, once again, going back, do your risk evaluation, do your risk assessment, and then search for appropriate countermeasures. So if you talk to somebody from IT, they will tell you, well, that there is Windows XP on this machine, well, upgrade it to Windows 10. Well, in some cases, you can't update Windows XP on the machine because the machine is only supported in that specific configuration. But there are other countermeasures to kind of counteract that. I mean, for instance, there are network devices, network appliances, which kind of put, let's say, a virtual patch around that machine. So that machine remains unpatched physically, but you cannot exploit the vulnerability from outside. So this actual attack vector has been closed. So from a, let's say, from a mitigation perspective, yes, if you have the chance to upgrade those old machines, do it. But let's be honest, in most cases, we don't have that choice. So we have to search for different countermeasures, and those might be air gapping the machine, basically not possible anymore, especially if you talk about remote maintenance and things like that. Or let's say, just wrap that virtual shield around that machine, which just prevents those, let's say, those network, especially network exploits from network vulnerabilities from being exploited. But for instance, this doesn't help if somebody tries to exploit a physical, let's say, vulnerability that requires physical access to the machine. So if you have the vulnerable machine and there is a valid scenario that somebody comes up with a USB thumb drive and sticks it in, well, you take a look at that scenario as well. So for instance, easiest thing might be just disable the USB ports. If that's not possible, try to find something that filters, for instance, any traffic between the USB port on the machine. If that doesn't work, at least do something like an inventory scan on a regular basis, every 2 or 3 weeks, for instance, just to make sure that the machine didn't get infected, because even that didn't happen in some time. So to make a long story short, I'm sorry for being so detailed, but the point is, do your risk assessment for this machine, for this line, for this cell, and then decide for countermeasures. And some of them might be technical, and some of them might just be, let's say, an organizational countermeasure or something else completely different. Sorry.
No, it's great. Nothing underscores the importance of taking that proactive approach, doing those intentional risk assessments first. You've given us great answers here today. We're about 3 minutes past, and I know we have another session that has started up, so I do want to encourage everyone to jump over to that. There are a number of great events coming tonight. We've got those listed over in the chat. So for all of you that showed up today, thank you so much for the great conversation. Udo, thank you for leading us through this as well and answering all the questions that we had. It's been great having you here to talk about this here at IIoT World, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the day here. So
Thanks for having me.
yep. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the next sessions.